my friends are simps.
Today I'd like to introduce you to one of Soma Labs' perhaps lesser known devices. Specifically, I'm talking about the Ornament-8. Now in the past I've done videos on the Lyra 8, which is a drone synthesizer, and also videos on the Pulsar 23, which, as I'm sure you know, is this beautiful analog drum machine synthesizer thing. Now Ornament-8 has some things in common with both of them in a philosophical sense, but it is also quite different because it is not a sound producing module. Instead, it is a generative organismic sequencer. Now the general idea behind Ornament-8, and the thing that kind of makes it special in many ways, is the fact that instead of having a neat grid where you place each individual step of your sequencer pattern very deliberately, this encourages you to create kind of evolving sequences based on the idea that each individual trigger is dependent on the behavior or the parameters of the one before it. Now, as I'm saying this, I'm realizing that that sounds pretty complicated and perhaps hard to understand, so I'll hopefully be able to explain how it works a bit more clearly in this video. There are a whole bunch of videos out there that talk about the Ornament-8, but I don't think there's any that kind of give it a neat, concise, kind of digestible overview, I think. So I'm going to try to do that. Whether or not I succeed will be another matter, but here we go. Now, similar to Pulsar 23, Ornament-8 is built on a series of posts, which is how you make the different connections between the various elements. This means that you can cram a lot more into a smaller space. You can also connect various points together without having to use a multiple or anything like that. And you can also make connections with your fingers, which is a pretty cool feature. Of course, this means that it plays particularly well with Pulsar 23 as well. Now at this point I have to say a massive thank you to signalsounds.com and also Soma themselves. I've had Ornament-8 on long-term loan for quite a while at this point, and to be honest, I've not used it much until fairly recently because I was fairly intimidated by it. It seems like a very complicated device at first, and I did not know where to begin with how to use this thing. And I wish I'd kind of got over that earlier, because once you start looking into it, yes, it has a lot of depth, but it's also fairly straightforward in terms of how it operates, or at least how you think about it. So don't be put off by its seeming kind of obtuse nature. So let's take a quick look at the basic features of it and how everything kind of works. It's worth saying I'm not going to go into a huge amount of detail about the individual elements specifically. Vlad from Soma Lab has a great series where he talks about a lot of that, and if you want to learn more about those kinds of things, then I would recommend going to watch that. Instead, I'm going to give a kind of more broad overview to give you an understanding of the device and how it works and all that stuff. One of the most important things that you should know about the Ornament-8 is that it doesn't have a master clock. There is no way to set the tempo to a specific BPM, for example, so you couldn't type in 121 BPM and have it spit out a consistent clock in that manner. That's not its thing. Instead, every element within Ornament-8 kind of intermingles and reacts with each other. That is, in many ways, the beauty of this device. Now, the kind of makeup of Ornament-8 is that we've got 8 individual tracks, or cells as Soma call them. Now, there's various different ways that you can trigger a track or a cell to play. This can either happen by pressing the set button or by connecting something up to the trigger input post. Once triggered, each individual cell will become active or inactive depending on what setting you've got it at for a period of time that's set by the time knob. So this is like a gate or an envelope or whatever you want to call it. Now once the gate elapses, once the time has passed that you have set with that knob, it then sends a trigger or a pulse out via the trigger output post, and this allows you to connect up the different posts or the different tracks or cells or whatever you want to call them in such a way that you can have them all reacting off of each other. One of the most basic ways that you could set things up is in a kind of circular looping motion. So you could have cell 1 triggering cell 2, and then cell 2 triggering cell 1 when their respective periods end, going round and round and round. So you could have like a kick and a hi-hat or something like that. If you can understand that concept, then you can basically understand the way Ornament-8 works. There's a whole bunch of different outputs on here, including dedicated outputs for both Lyra 8 and Pulsar 23. Now, if you're already familiar with Lyra 8, you might be wondering how on earth you trigger it from Ornament-8, since it doesn't use posts on Lyra to make the connections. It's not really a modular system in that sense. And Soma have come up with a dedicated adapter that you clip on over the top of the touchpads, and it provides additional dedicated posts for each of the voices, which is really cool. I bought one of them myself recently, and I was surprised at just how well built it is. You don't screw it on or anything like that, it just kind of clips on the top. And I don't know why I was surprised, because everything Soma make is really well made, but that is how everything kind of operates together if you want to use a Lyra in your system, or your setup, I guess I should say. Now, in addition to the fundamental features that I've outlined in terms of how each thing triggers everything else, there are also much deeper ways that you can modulate and start to make things a bit more interesting. Now, each individual cell can either be positive, negative, or completely deactivated. And this means that by default, you can either have it so that the trigger will turn on a sound or make a cell active, or the trigger will deactivate a cell or cut off the sound. And this is great for making kind of drum rhythms or kind of offbeat patterns where they aren't all playing at the same time. And flicking the switches about as you go can produce some really cool results. Now, there's also a bunch of additional posts in there, including a 2x multiplier and a CV in and out, which corresponds somehow to the time knob. I don't fully understand all of the specifics of how these work in terms of the technical side of things, but it's safe to say that they give you different ways to make your sequences a bit more interesting, and when you start to involve them in the process, things get really unpredictable and really pretty satisfying. The point here really is that there are a whole host of interesting possibilities that you just have to explore to discover. Now, as much as Ornament-8 is very clearly designed to work in harmony with Pulsar 23 and Lyra 8 specifically, that is not the end of the story. There are a number of dedicated converters at the top of Ornament-8 that allow you to go from the post system to mini jack connections, and this means you can use Ornament-8 as a sequencer for your modular system, your Eurorack, or any other device which will take CV in that way. You could also, if you had a CV to MIDI converter, use it as a kind of MIDI drum machine sequencer, which might take a wee bit of setting up, but would also be really cool as well. So it's not limited just to the other Soma devices, which I think people sometimes think it is. Now, this is where Ornament really became cool for me and really interesting, because as soon as I started thinking about it as more than just a device for sequencing Pulsar, the possibilities started opening up in my mind. One of the experiments I did early on was to plug it into my Squarp Rample, which is this kind of sample playback module within my Eurorack system. It has got 4 gate inputs, and it allows you to cycle through different samples on each voice. And this was particularly cool when you used melodic samples, because then it could build up this really interesting soundscape from the kind of chants and you know, the unique approach to sequencing that Ornament-8 has. Have a listen and you'll see what I mean. The process of discovery is such a large part of the pleasure of using Soma's devices, and honestly, once I started to get involved with Ornament-8 and, you know, get in there and making the connections, I found myself in that state where I could just sit for like 20, 40 to 60 minutes at a time, trying out and finding new sounds and sequences that I wouldn't have found otherwise if I was just using a standard step sequencer. As somebody who spent a lot of time trying to make sure that all of my gear can be perfectly in sync so that I can record it in loops into Logic without any lag or anything like that, you know, getting an ERM multi-clock, this kind of process does make me a wee bit uneasy, at least in the sense of how to make music with it. However, the fact that the Ornament-8 helps you break out of that mindset and encourages you to find things that you wouldn't otherwise is part of its beauty, and it's, I mean, one of the great things about it. Ornament-8 is great for experimentation, and it really rewards you for thinking outside of the box, and for that reason I don't actually think it's all that important that you understand things like the 2x multiplier or the technical reasons of what the CV control is actually doing, because really it's all about that kind of exploration and seeing what you come up with purely by accident. With that said, if you are somebody that likes to dig into all of that and understand the relationships between things, there's plenty of documentation out there from Soma that tells you what each individual bit does, and you can really dive as deep as you want to in that regard too. I have genuinely really enjoyed experimenting with Ornament-8 so far, and I know that I've only scratched the very tip of the surface of what it can do. This will be an amazing tool for people that like to get hands-on with alternative approaches to sequencing and not just kind of get stuck within the same 4 on the floor kind of paradigm. I can also see this being an amazing way for people to play live performances, particularly those that like the kind of experimental, generative style of modular systems. Thanks again to Soma and Signal Sounds for sending me this over to check out. You should definitely go have a look on both of their respective websites. Signal Sounds in particular are wonderful people who've been very supportive and helpful to me. Go have a look. If you happen to have an Ornament-8 and you've done some weird experiments with it, I want to know, because that is part of the joy of having one of these, is trying it out in ways that you wouldn't otherwise think to. For now, tatty bye.